Shout out and appreciation to Jillian Mayer in the back for carrying the bulk of the labor and more to put this together. So. And we're thrilled that it's finally, we're getting some really meaningful traction on this issue. As you're probably aware, there's divestment bills in both chambers of the State House, as well as a joint resolution. We met with Treasurer Pierce multiple times. Just yesterday, in fact, she issued a press release on climate change engagement. Maeve McBride was on Vermont Edition last week talking about divestment. And of course, in the state, we've had 3 colleges divest or commit to divesting from fossil fuels. And then there's lots of worldwide movement and traction. The Guardian recently divested. Of course, I'm sure you've heard of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund divested as well. So we're thrilled about the traction that divestment is getting. And we're going to dig into that conversation a little more tonight. We're going to have a panel discussion.
First is, the moment really is right for action. Look, I've obviously been following this a long time, and in one way it's the most hopeful, and in the other the most depressing moment that we've been in. The depressing part's easy. The planet is really starting to implode in bad ways. To look at California and see the Sierra Nevada without any snow on it for the first time anyone's ever recorded. To look at the study that came out today indicating that with climate change proceeding unchecked, we can expect a 6,000% increase in the number of extreme heat events over the course of the century. To look at what's going on in the Arctic and the Antarctic and the acidifying oceans and on and on and on is to understand that we're right now in these few years at an absolute hinge moment in the history of this planet. And it's too late to stop it altogether, but it's not too late, or at least the best science would indicate, perhaps to keep it from getting absolutely out of control. That's the depressing, hard truth. The really good truth is, for the first time in the 25 years that I've been working on this, there's a real chance of getting it under control for 2 reasons, really. One is the rise of this movement all over the world that finally is taking this on, and it really is an amazing movement. And man, you get some sense of how far it reaches when you see that today in Rome, the Vatican was talking in the strongest possible terms about all this. Its official kind of laying the groundwork for Francis's upcoming encyclical was talking about climate change as change on an almost unfathomable scale on this planet, and that is just the right kind of language to be using. People power, which in many ways began in Vermont, and there were people in this room who were on that march 7 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago, up the west side of Vermont. Over 1,000 of us walked up to Burlington, and at the time, that was the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the United States. That is now swelled all over the world, and it's beautiful to see. There are people meeting in rooms like this in every corner of the planet tonight. The other reason that it's so hopeful is that we finally have a real alternative to fossil fuel. The fact that in the last 6 years the price of a solar panel has fallen 75% is this piece of new data in the system that is throwing every old assumption into question. More than half of the electric generating capacity installed around the planet last year was renewable for the first time in history. If we can speed that up, if we can accelerate it, if we can make it really work, then we've got an outside fighting chance. That's why the divestment stuff is so important right now, because it is one of the most effective monkey wrenches we can throw into the fossil fuel industry, who are the reason that it has taken so long to get anywhere. It's not because the science hasn't been clear, and it's not because we don't, as I say, have alternatives. It's because we have an active, powerful resistance to change that comes from the richest industry on Earth. And that's why, just as with apartheid 30 years ago, we need this dramatic step of divestment to weaken their power. But one place I'll disagree with people on the panel is the idea that Vermont has the capacity to lead here. Vermont's no longer in a position, sadly, to lead. We did our best to give Beth Pierce and the legislature and the governor that chance when we sort of started this drive 3 years ago. But at this point, I mean, the fact that the Rockefellers have divested from fossil fuel and the state of Vermont hasn't is an upside-down world. Okay? It is, we're at risk of becoming, not at risk of being a leader, we're at risk of being an embarrassment. Prince Charles announced yesterday that he had divested from fossil fuels. Okay, when you have, you know, this sort of slightly jug-eared monarch class, you know, divesting, then it is time for Vermont to do the right thing. And I'm going to just speak completely frankly here for a minute. You know, I'm not a Vermont native. I came from the Adirondacks here. The Adirondacks is wild and woolly territory. We tend not to be quite as polite as people in Vermont. Okay, so I will just say it's ridiculous that this hasn't happened already in Vermont. As with too many other issues, our leaders have been playing games with it. Peter Shumlin has said one day that he's for it, and the next day that he's not sure, the next day that it's not the most important thing, and then the next day for it again. The treasurer has been, now I'll try to be polite, has presented a series of sham arguments that do not hold up. The one piece of paper that she clings to, this NEPC study, has been demonstrated time and again to be wrong. Among other things, it took the wrong class of stocks, not even the 200 that we were talking about. When you do the stocks that everyone else in the rest of the world has been divesting from, it's clear that Vermont would have been far better off to divest it. Beth Pierce has cost the workers of this state large amounts of money in their pension fund. Trustees of the University of Vermont, appointed in part by the governor, has cost students at UVM large amounts of money that they should have had for more scholarships and more professors and more sort of things. It's one of these rare cases where one gets to do well by doing good. You know, we honor people who make great sacrifices in the name of doing the right thing. In this case, we're asking people to make money by doing the right thing. I'm so glad to see, my eyes aren't very good enough to make out in the back of the room, Anthony Kalina, who has been stand-up on this from the beginning. The idea that we should instead engage in something called engagement with this industry is simply wrong. There are many times when that's just the right thing to do. And in fact, Treasurer Pierce proved that it was there many times when it's the right thing to do with this. She put out her press release yesterday, perhaps in preparation for this evening's event, when she talked about how she persuaded the Krispy Kreme donut company to stop using the wrong kind of palm oil in their donuts. Okay? That's exactly the sort of place where shareholder engagement works, because Krispy Kreme donuts is not in the palm oil industry, they're in the donut industry. Okay? And so it's a marginal part of their business, and we can push on those sort of things and get change. If Apple's not paying the folks who make its iPhones enough, we can talk about pressure on them or boycotts and things, and eventually they get the message and they raise the pay of their workers and the cost of an iPhone goes up $1 and everybody's okay. That's not the case with fossil fuels. What we need to have happen is for them to leave 80% of their reserves in the ground, as Eric Beth pointed out, and what we need for them to do is stop exploring for more of this stuff. We already have 5 times as much carbon in our coal, oil, and gas reserves as anybody says we can possibly burn, and yet ExxonMobil spends $100 million every day looking for more. Okay? That's crazy behavior, especially when you think about what $100 million can do in terms of putting up new solar panels every day hither and So the moment has come to do this, and the moment is, I have no idea why it's taking so long in Vermont for this to happen, but we have to, I guess, we'll see. It sort of appeals to reason and all the data and things like this work, or if we're going to have to do it the hard way. I just came back from Harvard, which, you know, a week at Harvard where we were having this argument play out. Harvard's one of the few universities that just outright said, no, we're not going to do it. It didn't completely surprise me because Harvard is very slow about everything. It was in 1869 when its president said it would take some generations before it was clear whether it was a good idea to educate women or not. And he added that he hoped that Columbia or Yale might undertake the experiments, you know, well, at Harvard, happily, students, faculty, and alumni really came together. And since it was Harvard, some of the alumni were great. I mean, like Natalie Portman and stuff like that. People were I'm a little hunched over. It's because I spent much of the week sleeping in a sleeping bag in the flower bed outside the president's office, helping students who were blockading the thing. It was a remarkable scene, and it will reverberate, and if it doesn't win at Harvard, it will help in many other places. Even in the week that we were there, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, one of the oldest and richest universities in Europe, and the place where the chemist Joseph Black discovered carbon dioxide 200 years ago, announced that it was divesting.
I'm going to talk about the climate risk and how divestment connects to that, because that's been the bread and butter of my work now for about 18 years. So I lead a group of computer modelers. We build models of complex systems, including the global climate, the global energy system. We build models of cities responding to flood under climate change, models of African countries responding to drought under climate change. In every one of those models, what we're doing is working with decision makers to help them look at what their choices are today and how those choices are going to play out under different climate scenarios, and really importantly, how their choices actually determine which climate scenarios are the ones that play out. One of the great privileges of getting to do this kind of work is that I've sat with probably hundreds of people facing these questions about the future, these questions about where should we act, what policy, should we plant trees, should we have a carbon tax, should we build levees and dikes, should we educate people, and on and on and on. You start to see patterns when you sit with those questions with enough people in enough different places. And I want to share with you a couple of those patterns, because actually they're pretty simple. So no matter which model we're using and which country we're working, the scenarios where people decide to turn away from fossil fuels sooner rather than later, those are the scenarios with the least risk of dangerous climate change. The scenarios where we wait, where we let it go longer and longer, those are the scenarios with the most risk of dangerous climate change. And those are the scenarios where the goals start slipping away from us. Right? Eventually, we reach a point where certain climate goals are just not achievable anymore. That's just the inexorable math of how CO2 works in the atmosphere. Because divestment is a solution, a lever in this battle to make that shift away from fossil fuels, those same patterns apply to divestment. The sooner we divest, the less risk of dangerous climate change. The longer we wait, the more risk. The sooner we shift, the more goals stay open and attainable. The longer we wait to divest, the longer we wait to shift, the more those goals slip out of reach. So that's one of my connections to the future, is just through my profession as a modeler. I'm also a mother of two teenage daughters who are actually in the room today. One of them's holding up a video camera. And so that's another connection that I have to the future. That really struck home for me the year my older daughter was a freshman in high school, which happened to be the year of Tropical Storm Irene. And so on top of all those normal transitions, like going from middle school to high school, being the first kid who didn't know anybody else in a new school, suddenly she was thrust into the middle same things I had to do, figure out a purpose, a meaning, a career, possibly meet partners, think about having children. But they're going to have to do all of that in a world that's a lot more challenging because of extreme climate impacts. And nothing we're going to talk about here tonight is going to change that, right? That's already done. That's the CO2 that's already been released, the decisions that have already been made. What we're here to talk about tonight is the difference between a really challenging future to navigate and an unmanageable future. Those are the choices that are left because we've left this so long. So that's my second connection to the future. First one is profession. The second one is a parent and the responsibilities to the future that comes with that. And so I've been thinking about the decisions before the Vermont Pension Investment Committee. I don't know if there's any members of that committee here, but actually I believe you have a lot in common in your work with what I have in mine. My colleagues and I, we work with analysis and data and projections, but always in this backdrop of risk and uncertainty. And at the end of the day, we do the best we can with what we know. The good thing when you're facing this divestment question is actually there's not much of a tension because, as you're going to hear from the other panelists, what's good financial management is actually good climate management. So it's actually not one of those cases where there's this great tension between multiple goals. The goals line up. But even so, it's a political world, it's a complicated world. And so I was asking myself what I could offer, what I could bring from my world and my colleagues that could be useful in weighing these decisions about divestment. And there's a few things I'd like to share. The first point is, it's not too late. Right? I want to say that again, because people are somehow missing this critical point. I feel like the world has gone from climate change isn't a problem, so we don't have to do anything, to, it's too late, so we don't have to do anything. But actually there's a whole universe in between those two, and that's where we live right now. It's really urgent and it's not too late. I could go on and on about our models, about technology, about policy, about the fact that the technologies are here and the rates of change are feasible and are actually starting to kick in. But the most important thing is just, it's not too late. The second lesson stands right up there against the it's not too late, which is time is incredibly short, unbelievably short. To explain that, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of the carbon budget. And if you've read any of Bill's work in the last years, you know probably this idea, so I'll be brief with it. The carbon budget is just an estimate of how much more carbon dioxide we can pump up into the atmosphere while keeping a really important climate goal possible. And that's the goal of limiting temperature increase to 2 degrees, the goal all the countries of the world have said is important, is critical. Scientists can estimate that number now, climate scientists have. You can think of it in an abstract way. Just picture a giant vessel up there in the atmosphere. That's the carbon budget. Every time someone down here on the surface of the Earth burns some oil or coal or natural gas, we add a little CO2 to that bucket. When it gets full, the carbon budget is used up. The chances for a 2-degree future are over, okay? That's what the carbon budget is all about. If you know how big that vessel is and you know how fast we're adding CO2 to it, then you can tell when will it be when we hit that point when the carbon budget is used up. And one of the models our group has built is just a little calculator that looks at those two things. How big is the bucket and how fast are we filling it? And so before coming here tonight, I ran a few scenarios using that calculator, and I want to just walk you through them because they're very interesting. So the first scenario is, what if the future kind of looks pretty much like the past? So for the past decade, year after year, there's an incremental increase in how much CO2 the global population has been putting into the atmosphere. If we just project that same rate of increase into the future, 22 years from now, that's how long it would take to fill up that bucket, that capacity, that carbon budget. Now I was thinking about that number, 22 years, and I thought about my other daughter's 9th grade social studies teacher, who I guess is about 30 years old. She's young, she just had her first baby. She's probably someone who has a retirement account in the Vermont Pension Fund. And I was thinking, 22 years, she's going to be in her early 50s. She won't even be tapping that retirement fund yet. And the possibility of a 2-degree future what climate scientists say is a risky but livable future is already out of reach for her baby daughter, who would be probably getting her first job at college. All right, so that's not going to work. Business as usual, keep doing the same thing. We don't want that. That's unacceptable. All right, well, let's say we do something the world's governments, despite having met for 20 years, haven't been able to do. We at least stop that increase. We just hold things steady. All right, so I ran the same tool with that scenario. Instead of more and more emissions, we just freeze them today. Next year, no more than this year. The year after that, no more than this year. That stretches out the carbon budget a little bit. My daughter's teacher would be in her late 50s instead of her early 50s. All right? Doesn't really matter for anyone who comes after that. For all intents and purposes, that goal is forever out of reach. Okay, so if flat's not good enough, what has to happen? Have to go down. That's the only other choice. So I did another scenario. I said, what if by 2050 we reduce emissions 80% below what they are today? All right, here's the good news. That works. My daughter's teacher would live through her retirement, happy old age. Her daughter could have a happy old age. And we would be staying below the carbon budget. That's what I mean when I say it's not too late. Okay? But I did one more scenario. This is probably the most important one. I said, what if we kept that same level of ambition, 80% below current levels by 2050? But what if we waited 10 years? What if we took 10 years to get ourselves organized, to work out all these political differences that we have? What if we let the fossil fuel companies continue their war of propaganda for 10 more years? In that scenario, my daughter's teacher would be in her early 80s when we used up the carbon budget. Now maybe that sounds great, like, yeah, we really bought some time, but it's still used up. I don't think people who come after us, future generations, are going to care how long we stretched it out. If we used it up, if we limited their chances for a stable climate, who cares when it happens? Right? So that's the importance of the next 10 years. If you're wondering why college students all over this country are sitting in their president's offices, it's because they understand that math. They know they don't have time to get seniority, to work their way up to be managers of pension funds, right? To get elected into the Vermont legislature. By the time they manage to do that, that carbon budget is going to be filled up to the point where it's not feasible, it's not manageable. Where that choice between a challenging future and an unmanageable future has already been made for them. So that's what divestment is about, because divestment is about part of that shift. And it doesn't mean this year we've got to squeeze every drop of carbon out of the atmosphere, out of the economy. It just means we've got to start turning in the opposite direction. Instead of more and more and more, we've got to start turning it down, less and less and less. And actually, it's not that mysterious how that happens, right? It just means somewhat less investment in digging up coal, oil, and gas, and somewhat more investment in insulating our homes and building efficient public transportation and scaling up renewable energy. It means shifting investment from dirty, polluting fossil fuels into clean, renewable energy. And that's what divestment is about. It's about saying that's the direction that we need to go. And it's acknowledging that the time to do that is really, really short. And we need every tool we can possibly muster.
So I would also like to say an incredible thank you to Bill McKibben from 350.org, who's keeping Eric and my phones ringing nonstop. The call for divestment, while it was, I think, made it this sort of a simpler request, because it was a very discreet request of sell these 200 names that are in the traditional energy space. It has left everybody questioning how they're invested. It has left everybody questioning why they can't invest in alignment of their values. And it is causing a lot of people to come to sort of question how they're invested. And for that, we want to incredible thank you.
2%. You're not going to bankrupt Exxon by selling your shares, and it's never been the idea behind this. All of us can do that math too, you know. But what you can do is begin to politically bankrupt them. The governing example here is in South Africa. Okay? That was the only other really large-scale divestment campaign that there ever really has been that really worked and really kicked at a large enough level. And Nelson Mandela got out, and there were lots of people that said, oh, well, someone else will just buy your GE stock or your California Bank stock, whatever it is. When Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first trip he took was to the United States, and he did not go first to the White House. He went first to California to thank students in the UC system as representatives of the 155 colleges around the country that had divested. He said, we fought for our own liberation, but we couldn't have done it without you. We needed that kind of external pressure too. That pressure is already starting to mount, and it's the reason that Mandela's great colleague, Desmond Tutu, has been at the forefront of this fossil fuel divestment effort since it launched. He said, the greatest human rights challenge now facing the world is climate change. That's why we need you to take up this weapon again that you used 30 years ago. 30 years ago, Treasurer of the state of Vermont and the Secretary of State led the country in divestment from apartheid-related stock. They didn't block the effort, as Beth Pierce is doing. They rounded up treasurers in a bunch of other states and got them on board. Okay? That's what leadership looks like, and that's what Vermont looked like, 30 years ago when we still did things in this state, before we descended into this kind of strange political paralysis that means almost nothing seems ever to get done in this town. That's why this is such a good opportunity, since it costs nothing, in fact, saves money for us all, for this to be one of the places where, as Beth said, we really get off the stick and do something for future generations. Remember the thing that she said, because it's so important, and that she was bringing new and useful and interesting new data runs from the incredible computer models these guys have built. The next 10 years decides the story. Okay? If we don't get it done soon, then the mistake we've made around climate change lasts way into geological time. Okay? We're at a hinge moment. The possibilities here, but we've got to just actually do it, and do it hard, and not sit around waiting for the perfect thing to happen. Not say, well, only we had a carbon tax, or only we had this or that or whatever else. We're all working on those things, but we can't get them until we break the power of this industry, an industry that at the moment the state of Vermont is in active cahoots with. So that's why divestment's important. Be able to hold its head up high. I don't really relish the thought of going and sleeping in the flower beds outside the Golden Dome. But I will if I have to, and I imagine there's other people out there who will do the same thing too. Thank you, guys.
What risks are you willing to take in the face of the next 10 years? What giant dreams are you willing to make real? And what holy hell